Great Wednesday. Welcome to the Fully Human Connections podcast. I'm your host, King, and I'm joined by my co-host, Reggie. So, how you doing today, Reggie?
I'm doing very well, King. Always good to see you on a Wednesday morning. Yeah, I cannot and will not complain.
Absolutely. Same here. Same here. So, as you know, we like to begin our shows talking about the gratitude moment to set the context and the energy for the show. So, you want to share what you're grateful for today, Reggie?
Sure. I usually start off with I'm predictable in this regard, but I'm really grateful for indoor plumbing, or electricity, and a refrigerator with food in it. And because I say that every week, I want to just be clear for anybody who's new to this podcast that I really mean that. Just the idea of all of the advantages of indoor plumbing. I won't get into the details of that. Um, but just in having a refrigerator with moderately fresh food, some leftovers, and um, that I can eat pretty much when and what I want to, puts me in a really good position in terms of the 8 billion people on the planet. So I'm deeply appreciative of that. That I'm relatively healthy, that I get to do work that I care about, um, that I get to have colleagues and friends like you. I'm just grateful for all of that. And, I'll stop there. I could go on because there's a lot I'm grateful for.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I concur with you. I'm grateful for those things you shared. So, I'll take your list and, of course, add to my life, health, ability to see, hear, walk, talk, stand, breathe, and have sound mind, and a mother who's alive and has sound mind, and grateful for the opportunity to continue to learn, grow and discover. I tell you, I don't know if it's being in my 50s now or just because I've gotten wiser, but I really truly understand and appreciate the importance of wisdom. When you understand something differently, you Stephen R. Covey talks about it, seeing it through a different paradigm. When your paradigm, your mental maps change. And as you know, as we talked about last week with Robert Keegan, increasing your mental competence, those things to me is more valuable. And at least I didn't appreciate or think about that when I was in my 20s and 30s, when you should, because you can get the most out of it. But
Yeah.
at least at some point in life, you do recognize and appreciate it. So those are things I'm grateful for as well.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. Wisdom.
Yeah, it's in Proverbs. I forgot now which actual scripture, but it does say, "Get wisdom, pay anything." It says, "Seek wisdom, pay anything." Basically.
Yeah.
And so when you really think about that in the context that there is never a price that's too high to pay for wisdom, because once you have it, it's invaluable.
Yeah. In fact, in my readings in the past 4 years or so, I'm not going to be able to cite exactly where I read this. I know I read it, um, but the authors, it was two authors. It might have been Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff in The Coddling of the American Mind, but I'm not sure that's where I read this. But they basically said of all of the virtues that we believe in, or that we have as potentially as human beings, that they can all be overdone at some level, except for wisdom. Like if
Mm.
it's truly wisdom, it can't be overdone. If it's just knowledge or arrogant knowing, then it's not wisdom. Then it can be overdone. But if it's truly wisdom, you can't have too much. Like it's always better to be wiser and wiser and wiser. Um, so that resonated when I read it, and I think I'm remembering exactly what I read. If I can't remember exactly who I was reading when I came across it, but that you pointed to that one, I'll call it a virtue. I think it is. Uh, makes a lot of sense. In that, when are you done growing in wisdom? Well, I hope never until I'm done breathing. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just in this point on this, that I remember Cornel West had was interviewed, and during the interview he said, I forgot the context of why he said it, but I remember the quote, which he said, they're asking him about being smart. How does he feel about being, because being a very smart person? He said, well, I would let the phones be smart. I'd rather be wise.
Hmm. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I thought that was a wise statement to make, and
Yeah.
that's definitely a difference. We see a lot of smart people, definitely see smart people in our leadership politically, but from an academic standpoint, from a background, professional background standpoint, so they definitely have the intelligence in that context, but we don't see the wisdom in the decisions they make on a regular basis.
Right. Yeah.
So just interesting there. But as we shift, why don't you talk about the context for our discussion for today?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. So, um, so we're speaking about healing America's narratives, the feminine, the masculine, our collective national shadow. There it is. Thank you, King, for sharing that. This tag on the subtitle is Becoming More Fully Human. And this is a book that came out in October of 2022, and it's about that very thing, healing the divisive, polarizing narratives that characterize America in the 21st century, the third decade of the 21st century, and really have characterized the country since its founding and in the century leading up to its founding. Um, and we've been going through the book chapter by chapter, and we're now in chapter 11, which is the second to last chapter of the book. And it's entitled So Now What? The first 10 chapters point out a lot of the issues and problems. And we've been speaking in the last several weeks about the collective, how to shift the collective. We speak about individual change, but also about the collective as well. And today we're going to introduce one of my real core learnings in my research for the book, something I didn't know anything about, and that I fortunately bumped into when I was researching the book. And it's based on the work of Nicholas Christakis, who's a professor. He's an MD and a PhD at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. And I'm going to actually, put up just something to share here as well, so people can see this as well as just hear it. And his book Blueprint is subtitled "The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society." And I'm just going to speak briefly to what really struck me in this book, and then we can get into our discussion about it in the context of healing America's narratives. So Christakis begins with identifying what he calls the social suite, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But his research led him to study what he called unintentional communities, intentional communities, and even artificial communities, to see what really held communities together. And with unintentional communities, he's speaking about things like shipwrecks and other stranded groups. So he studied what happened with various famous historical shipwrecks, including but not limited to, excuse me, the Shackleton expedition to the North Pole, where they got stuck in the ice. And it's a pretty famous story now. It's been captured in books and movies, and nobody died over the course of, I think, more than a year, where they had to separate and come back together. Everybody survived. So he studied situations like that, which he calls unintentional communities, when people are stranded against their will. They didn't choose it. Then he studied intentional communities, such as the Shakers, Brook Farm, the Kibbutzim, Twin Oaks, and those are communities that I'm superficially familiar with. I'm not going to explain each one of those because they were new for me, other than the Kibbutzim. They were new for me, but basically how people come together intentionally in community, and what works and what doesn't, and how some last and some don't. And then there's other examples which I won't get into immediately. But in his studies, what he came up with were basically 8 features in communities that lasted and survived. These 8 features, or most of them, were present. In communities that broke down and didn't survive, these 8 features either were absent or broke down over time. So just really briefly, communities that last, again, this is what Christakis calls the social suite, have the capacity to have and recognize individual identity, meaning they're not just a mass or a collection of people or beings or creatures, but they're able to recognize the individuality of those in the group. There's love for partners and offspring. So unlike some mammals and some other living creatures on Earth, community and human communities express love for their chosen partners and their offspring. They have the ability to form friendships. They build social networks, including, but also precluding, what we now have as social networks on, online, basically social media. So this idea of social networks predates computers and the internet. Cooperation is a characteristic of the social suite. And then there's a few that some people think are, perhaps not really desirable, but that in fact are important and are prevalent in successful communities. There is a preference for one's own group, what's known as in-group bias. Now, taken to an extreme, it can lead to wars and different things, but there is a preference for one's own group. And that's not a problem because it's just a preference, not a line in the sand and an alienation. They're characterized by what he calls mild hierarchy or relative egalitarianism, in which we afford some prestige to specific members. Typically, those members who already have lots of connections and can connect us with others, or who are able to teach us things. And then finally, the social suite is characterized by communities that have social learning and teaching. In other words, we're not on our own and we can trust others to teach us what we need to know, what would be beneficial. So those are the 8 characteristics that Christakis puts forth as this social suite, and that in his research characterized unintentional communities like shipwrecks and people stranded on islands for whatever reason, intentional communities where people come together intentionally to live together, and even artificial communities, which I'm not going to get into because I don't fully understand them in his explanation. I don't want to try to make believe that I do. So these are the 8 characteristics, and they fit into Healing America's narratives because as I look at the 8 of these, I see that, the first one, the capacity for individual identity and to recognize it, Americans pretty much have that. Love for partners and offspring, yeah, we pretty much have that. We have friendships, and this is across the political spectrum. People that I vote for, that I would never vote for, people I agree with, that I don't agree with. We have social networks. We have cooperation. An interesting place we have cooperation is we're really good at responding to disasters to help people we might not ordinarily associate with. But then once the disaster is done, we go back to our ways. We have preferences for our own groups, and this is a place in America where our in-group bias, in my language, becomes somewhat pathological, where we grow into an us versus them bias as opposed to us with them bias. So beginning with number 6, we bang into some issues. Our mild hierarchy, which we have in America, I believe has grown into a fairly significant hierarchy where there are, based on financial wealth and social status, that it's no longer a mild hierarchy, but there's a real like absence of egalitarianism in American society, where we put celebrities and wealthy people up on pedestals, and we even have unequal access to the law, basically, not fulfilling the promise of the 14th Amendment based on celebrity and wealth. And then finally, social learning and teaching. I think we are relatively successful with that we're not on our own. But one of the flaws that we have, which is an outgrowth and this is my opinion about this last one, it's an outgrowth of the prevalence of social media and online availability of information, where our social learning and teaching doesn't have any moderation or really good editing. So a lot of people find information online and never bother to find out if it's accurate or true or can be proven true. And so this idea of social learning and teaching and not being on our own is great. But in the absence of informed, honest editors or moderators, it becomes kind of like the Wild West where anything goes because it doesn't matter if it's true or not if I believe it. So this framework, the social suite, at its healthiest, I find would be a good trajectory, especially in number 6, 7, and 8, for us to get healthy in American culture and society in order to heal our narratives. So that's a mouthful there. The book is really extensive in the examples he provides and his interpretation of his research, but this is a real quick overview. It's a chip on the tip of a very big iceberg that I think is important. So I'll be quiet now.
Well, I think that's definitely another great topic you've chosen for today, from your book, as far as what you write about the narratives. And it's interesting that you chose to quote and use as your source, Nicholas Christakis, because, I read his book, Connected, The Surprising Power About Social Networks, years ago. And that helped me kind of really understand the power of, and came up with my philosophy and my model formula, connecting with intent, and understanding really why it's so important to intentionally choose the people you're building with and the people you're going to communicate with, which I later on I didn't create the term tribe, but I applied tribe to what I call a conventionally intelligent tribe of individuals that you intentionally create and add and build with, because of the impacts of having people in your network that's going to impact you, whether it's health related, whether it's education, whether it's financial. So now, as we relate it to today's topic, having, as it talks about those 6 to 7 or 6 to 8, what I really see as you really look at today's society, how we now are allowing media and social media, and again, talked about this prior to the show starting, the intelligent leaders who lack wisdom force us into these different tribes based off their agenda. And we see it play out, and we've seen it play out throughout history, but we see it play out even more and more dangerous, I think, consequences now, because of the fact that, people now are more willing to be prone to violence because the atmosphere and the environment is such that if you really believe that you really don't have a purpose in life and someone can connect you to a hateful purpose and you attach to that, then you at that point can be used as a weapon to go against someone who's outside your group, outside your tribe, that's not quote unquote your people. So now my question for you with that context, what do you see as ways that we can learn from what Nicholas Christakis talks about as a way of beginning to counter that, as it relates to now in your book, you talk about what's now what. What do you see as ways that we can begin to start to build these bridges when we have different ideologies, different physical differences that we see, even ideologically difference in how we see each other and how we behave?
Yeah, so that's an easy question. That's a little question I love the question. So, and I have a real strong bias in my answer, and by bias, it's not about race or gender or anything like that. The typical biases that we have. But in terms of what I think is possible for 330 some odd million human beings in a country, I think the first step is what you and I have been talking about since last June. Um, the first step is coming to terms with things as they are, getting some level of agreement on the realities, the truths of American history. So before we can, I'm just going to say these out loud again, before we can really, uh, have a healthy preference for in-group bias and not the us versus them, before we can, really see that we're giving way too much credibility and almost, sacredness to rich wealthy people or celebrities, which we have we have a culture of celebrity in this country. We love famous people and wealthy people and successful people, and I'm not suggesting we shouldn't admire them when they deserve admiration if they're really good at something, but that we should aspire to be the best version of ourselves, not to be like the people we like. In other words, the old Jewish parable is, that the rabbi, basically said to one of his congregation that your job isn't to be more like Moses, it's to be more like you. In other words, the goal is to be the best version of yourself, not to be like Moses, or if you're a Christian, not to be like Christ, but, a Moses-like version of yourself or a Christ-like version. So we need to come to terms with, to really embody, what Christakis is saying is possible. And again, most of the groups he was talking about were relatively small compared to 330 million people in a country. We need to own a history of violence, a history of elevating some voices while subjugating other voices, a history of excess and greed. I mean, all of the traits of the shadow that you and I have been speaking about, I'll just say them out loud in case people haven't memorized them already or haven't heard this before. But the 9 traits of American shadow, the parts of our history that we deny and project onto other countries and other people, are ignorance, arrogance, fear, bigotry, greed, excess, violence, bullying, and untrustworthiness. And as you hear those, if that brings up anger, like that's not America, Americans aren't like that, that's the perfect proof that it's shadow, because we deny it. If you look at history, like 3 basic groups, and there are many groups, but the 3 foundational groups in America who were subjugated, and subjugated is not even a strong enough word: women, Native Americans, and Africans who became African Americans. And in fairness, the indigenous peoples of what we now call the Americas who became Native Americans, to get the language clear, they weren't equal to anybody. They were horribly subjugated, enslaved, betrayed, had their land stolen. So until we own all of that history and not treat it as ancient history, but see its current manifestations, whether it's on reservations, whether it's in income disparities amid the races, whether it's in different interest rates for blacks and whites in the same location looking to buy a house, mortgage rates. There's all these manifestations of the ongoing subjugation. Until we really own that, till enough of us own what's true, moving into this idea of cooperation and loving each other and healthy iterations of in-group bias, I think will be relatively kind of mythic, like make-believe. Because until we do the work we need to do as a country, moving into these healthy communities that have most of the characteristics of Christakis' social suite, I don't think it's possible until we do the work. So I'm fairly optimistic guy. Like I don't walk around with my head down saying, woe is me, I'm doomed or we're doomed.
Okay.
But that's why the book exists. Until we do the shadow work, until we own these issues that are 246 years old as a country and closer to 400 years old, as what led up to the country being founded. Um, the current violence, polarization, us versus them, political divisiveness, and lack of cooperation is going to continue, um, because we don't believe in the same history in this country. We have all different iterations of it, and the far left and the far right uh, seem to be doing everything they can to continue to keep us polarized.
Exactly. And so that's what I was going to say is that, and I get your point, until we come together and until we can deal with our collective shadow, then we're not going to come together. But I go back to the leaders that I talked about before. Their agenda is to keep us separate. Like, they don't want us to come together. They want to keep us more confined or more double down in their ideological beliefs in that particular tribe.
Yeah.
Like, for example, I watched this show last night. Interesting enough, it's called Accused. It's a new show called on Hulu, and basically it's like a 10-part series, which each show is a different character or a different story, and it's about defendants on trial. And it's giving their perspective of what they're going through and how the justice system is and what they're experiencing. And the very first one was a gentleman, or the show was about a guy who was a doctor, and he was a neuroscientist, had a perfect life, but his son, his youngest son, was one who just wasn't connected with how he was raising him. So long story short, he felt isolated, he felt angry, he felt a victim. And so as a result, you saw and I didn't realize this because the show description was very short. It didn't really set this context, but it ended up being his son ended up having the character traits and behavior traits of a mass shooter. And it showed how the path towards that just progressed downward. Even though his father was a neuroscientist and put him in the schools, they showed this kid just having all this anger and just feeling like no one understood him. And so him and another colleague that he found on the internet wanted to buy guns and, of course, enact a school shooting, which after watching that, what happened in Nashville, is like, watching it, like, it's too soon, it's too much raw emotions around it. Mm-hmm. But it gave me the first hand, because I never could relate to a person who can go do that. But now watching that show, and I know this is scripted, but I could begin to see how a person can begin to disconnect themselves from modern society and say, because of what they've been fed constantly, but depending on what news source or information source where they get their information from, that either you're a victim, people are coming to get you, things are being done to you, or things have been done to you. However the narrative is written, I can see where someone who is feeling, I don't have any friends, the typical, characteristic pattern that's created, the profile, so to speak, how a person now can say, because of that, the only thing I can do now is go out here and let the world know how I feel about it, because life no longer matters to me. I don't feel love. The energy of love is missing. Is how I sum all that up. So anyway, I'm sorry. Where I'm going with this is that this is what I continue to see even now with current events, with former President Trump being indicted, and then 34 counts. And then you listen to some of the counts that he's been indicted, and how the counts are broken down. Even though I do believe Trump is guilty of a lot of crimes, but the sensationalization of 34, where you have the way they broke down the counts, it could have just been one count and they created 6 counts from it. And then you got the racial dynamic of it being a black DA that's prosecuting them, and how that's been handled and how everyone's talking about that. So even though in our society, in our day-to-day lives, I think that blacks and whites are operating more collectively, but on a media-wide, we're being forced to be separate, and you've been forced to pick a side. and listen to people who I respect on one hand for maybe their business acumen, their business experience, their business accomplishments, but when they talk about how they feel about things politically, and they choose Trump because, again, you can sit here and say, well, you can point to other presidents and say, for this particular charge from New York, did he really need to be indicted for that? Because it definitely is going to embolden his base and disconnect us even further. So that's where I'm saying right now is how the polarization is causing a further divide. Now, my question becomes, how do you get people to now say, I want to get connected to someone whose ideals are different than mine, who thinks differently about their politics, who thinks differently about how they feel about whether progressive change is happening in the country or not, and then more importantly, how they feel about themselves as it relates to their definition of what America looks like to them.
Yeah. So, my response to that, as you were asking the question, there was a stunning quote. I mean, I forget, it might have been 30 years ago, and it was based in it was during Bill Clinton administration when America got involved in the um, uh, in Serbia and Croatia with the war over there, and there was a group of peacekeepers who went over there to talk to people on all sides of that issue. I'm going to answer your question. And one of the peacekeepers was a guy who used to be a Salvadoran um, rebel in Central America during the times of when there was a lot of war and trouble down in Nicaragua and El Salvador and other places. And he had since stopped being that person, and he had gone to law school, and he was pretty much learning to be a peacekeeper. And what he said when he came back from the meetings I forget if they were in Serbia or Croatia, I forget where they took place exactly. What he said really struck me, and this is based on his own experience in civil war in his own country. He said, in my country, we stopped fighting because we were tired. Both sides were exhausted from the ongoing conflict. We just wanted to stop because we were just tired from it. He said, these people, meaning the two sides over in Eastern Europe, they still have 2 or 3 more years of fighting left in them before they get tired enough. That's a paraphrase. And so, I think a first step here in America has to be where enough people, and it's going to happen from the middle out, almost, I want to say mathematically, it has to, but where enough people who can see both sides, and that's not a lot of people yet, but enough people who can see both sides get to the point where they just start saying, hey, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not part of this us versus them thing. We need to find a way to put our weapons down. And again, in this case, it's not in some ways it is guns and bullets, but primarily not. And we need to stop. We have to get exhausted from the polarization until we have enough people who are developed enough to see what's going on, the extremes of the left and the right, to see the talking heads on TV, people who make millions of dollars a year based on feeding the fires of sensationalism, to see the people in Congress who make not millions, but they make their $175K a year, and by feeding the fires of polarization. Until enough Americans develop the point they can see all of that. It's not just the Republican Party. It's not just the Democratic Party. It's not just that one party. Although, right now, there's a wing of the Republican Party that's out of control, the MAGA Republicans, because they believe in things that aren't true, and they say them out loud over and over again. But until enough Americans get exhausted by the polarization and the infighting, and they're developed enough where they can take multiple perspectives and see, oh, both sides are creating this, and they say that's enough. Stop. Until enough Americans can do that, we're going to be stuck. Because we have to. I mean, I'm tired of it. I've been looking at, and I'm not somebody directly. I've never been involved directly in a school shooting or a mass shooting of any kind. I know one person who lost a son in a school shooting. But I've been studying violence in America for the last 25 years or so. It's in studying other things, but looking at that, I can't imagine what a parent or a survivor of somebody who was killed in that as a country. Because if we were tired of it, we would do something about it.
And
And
so that break.
Yeah,
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
go ahead.
No, you go ahead. That was my rant.
That brings to mind a statement that was made by Anthony Robbins. He said that two things bring people to action: either desperation or inspiration. And desperate, and you talk about people getting tired of it. And say, I was thinking about the inspiration side of it, where say I want to grow, I want to develop, I want to become a better human being, I want to become more fully human, as we talk about the basis or the theme of our podcast. Whereas, as you laid out, and I'm not saying this is in contrast to how you're thinking at all, so I know you're on the growth mindset as well, but getting people to say, well, I'm so tired of it, this is what I'm going to do. I'm forced to react in this context, as opposed to us creating the environment where I want to do it because it's better. Like, I see more value. There's this term now when you really study how networks connect and people come together and trying to get create what's called a network effect. A network effect is when someone joins a network, and because more people join a network, that those people bring value to the network, and that creates a network effect because it becomes more valuable. Like Facebook, the more people get on Facebook and engage, the more valuable it becomes. I think what has to happen is opposed to people begin desperate and saying I'm tired of it is I think people have to see more value in choosing to become inspired, because just being tired of the polarization really doesn't change your circumstances in your life. So even if we were to filter out all the noise of the politics and the divisiveness being spread throughout that, you're still dealing with the fact of most people now, because of economics, are in survival mode. And if you're in survival mode, you're never going to be creative, or it's very difficult to be very creative because you're too busy trying to survive. You can't, like you talked about before, in your gratitude moment, you said, well, I'm grateful for indoor plumbing. I'm grateful for having food in my refrigerator that I can choose to eat when I want to, how I want to. Having that part of your needs taken care of allows you to say, I can put mental energy towards now being creative and doing things that, bring me fulfillment spiritually wise, so, mentally. So that to me is where we got to get people to start thinking along those lines, that it's better for you long term. There's more value in choosing love and choosing to grow mentally and connect than it is choosing hate and divisiveness. That to me has to be where we got to get people, and it's not going to be all people. To your point, like you said, certain people have to be able to see both sides to be unbiased, but then not only be unbiased, but also be at the point of being so principle centered that they're willing to say, if given the opportunity to now go on MSNBC and get paid millions of dollars for a contract, or Fox and get paid millions of dollars for a contract, and choose one side because people see they're charismatic and they can be influential, and I'm going to grab this person now, put you on MSNBC, and put you in a situation where you're now pushing this agenda. And here's your check. So, in other words, now have to be able to hear both sides, but then at the same time be at the core principle centered to say, I'm not going to allow myself to be led down that path for financial gain.
Yeah, and so what I hear you describing, King, and I agree with everything you just said, and something we spoke about last week when we spoke about Robert Keegan's immunity to change um, program and process, and his research. There's basically 5 stages of development that he points to, but 2 of them are really relevant to what we're talking about, and it's the move from the socialized mind, and that's just what it sounds like. It's in the language we've been using, it's your mind. You have a socialized mind if you're still at the effect of or still impacted by your cultural givens. What the society and your culture gave you as the truth, and you belong to that. That's a socialized mind. You can develop. It's not guaranteed. Many, probably, I'd say most adults, I shouldn't say that because I don't know the numbers, but many adults, that's the safer way to say it, stay in the socialized mind throughout their entire lives. The next move, though, is to the self-authoring mind. Now, what's interesting, because I love the example you said, whether it's Fox News or MSNBC, both of those networks have intelligent people on them. In other words, they can read, they can write, they can add, they can subtract, multiply, and divide. They can speak relatively clearly. They can make good arguments. But to the extent that they deliver their news commentary as they do in the given network that they are getting paid by, they may think they're self-authoring, that in fact they have an independent view of things. But in both cases, they are simply mouthpieces for the larger intersubjective culture that MSNBC kind of represents more to the left and that Fox represents more to the right. So, at certain points in their life, they may practice self-authoring, but in terms of how they deliver their commentary, they are socialized minds because they're just speaking through the lens of a given worldview that they think is theirs, but it's by no means self-authored. It's society authored. It's socialized until they can begin to see that. And some do. Some people leave those networks. Some people leave the New York Times or the Washington Post or other print media because they don't like the socialization of the organization. But development is possible for all of us, but it's not guaranteed for anybody, and that's the dicey piece. And there's some good news. You mentioned Trump's indictment, which was yesterday. Leading up to the 2020 election, 4 or 5 months before it began, before the election took place, he began planting the seeds that the only way he could lose was if the election was stolen, if there was election fraud. He began saying that in August of 2020. So by the time he lost, all of the people who thought he was a good guy and trustworthy had been socialized, literally socialized into believing that if he loses, it's because it was stolen.
Mm-hmm.
Fact be damned, his own director of national cybersecurity saying this is the most secure election in the history of the United States didn't matter. In fact, he got fired for his report.
Right.
And he tried that again as this, New York State indictment was approaching, calling people to protest and show up in New York. And interestingly, almost nobody did. Most of the crowds, if you saw any of the images, were journalists. There were a handful of people on both sides yelling at each other, but his troops didn't answer the call this time. And I believe this is what I just said about the who showed up. You can look that up, and that's factual. But what I believe is true. Over 1,000 people were arrested post January 6th. And you can go to the Justice Department's website and see their names and where they are in terms of their indictments and their guilty or not guilty pleas and how all that's playing out. Donald Trump has used over $10 million that he raised from his political action committee for his own legal fees. So money he's raising based on his followers for his next presidential run, he's using personally to pay his lawyers. He hasn't used any of that money to pay for the legal fees for any of the 1,000 people who, in their socialized minds, came to Washington, D.C. on January 6th, reached the Capitol, got arrested, and are now either doing time or paying fines or whatever it happens to be. So when he put out the call this time, it seems some people began to self-author a little bit. Oh, here's what happened on January 6th. Now he's saying, let's do it again. Different scenario. I'm not going to New York because people got arrested and he didn't help them. He didn't get arrested for that. He incited the riot, but he's being indicted on, paying hush money to a prostitute and some other things. So that's actually a positive thing. It's a tiny little positive thing, but it's really based in self-preservation. Well, I'm not helping him anymore because he didn't help people who trust him. But there's still, there were members of Congress with megaphones outside of the courthouse in New York chanting USA as though supporting Donald Trump was a vote for America. So, it's a real mess out there. And nobody's particularly, that's an overstatement, not everyone is particularly interested in doing their homework and finding out what's true and what's not. And so the immediate odds of Nicholas Christakis' social suite getting in its healthiest iteration, getting a real foothold in this country, that's something for us to aspire to. But there's a lot of interference on the road to getting there, I think.
Yeah, there is. And unfortunately, it seems as though your voice is coming through kind of distorted. It's not as clear as it's been. I'm not sure if it's an internet connection or not, but you're not freezing. It's just that your voice is coming out kind of distorted. But I heard most of what you said, or I heard all of it through the distortion. And I agree with you that, people need to see. I guess my thing is, I'm looking at what's going to cause that tipping point, as Malcolm Gladwell talks about in his book. What's going to cause a tipping point for folks to do that? And even the media, to show you how everybody just consumed for clicks now, and the media has taken it to another level. They're like YouTube people who post a video and just put a clear lie in the description so you can click on it. They call it clickbait. Well, the media is just as guilty of that as well. Like watching different news programs, they literally had cameras set up outside of the courthouse, outside of Trump's, where Trump was staying, downtown locations, and the analysts were just talking before Trump even showed up, and they were just talking around. Well, this is what traffic looks like. This is what Trump's going to have to come through. Here's the courthouse. Here's the doors he's going to be going through. And that's the news they're reporting. This is the news. And it's like, you have nothing better than to tell us the conditions and the environment that's, like you're polarizing, like you want something to happen. You want to get people down here. You want to get violence. You can sit back and say, well, look at this mess we created. So it's like you're manufacturing that consent of that, as Noam Chomsky talks about. Yeah. And so that's why I say we have to get to the point where people wake up, and this is what I mean when I say wake, we become woke in the context that you become conscious of the people that you're listening to or saying things is not in your best interest. And that's what you have to begin to say, this is what I got to disassociate myself from that line of thinking and begin to align myself with people who are more in alignment with my principles and purpose in life, and begin to put my time, energy, and attention and intention building with them, as opposed to just living my doing day-to-day life. I keep telling folks that either it's more prevalent than ever that either you're living someone else's plan or you have your own plan, but you're not in the middle. So either you're setting your agenda on a daily basis, you're working towards your goals, or you're working towards someone else's goals. That's what life has now become because of the manufacturing of consent to get you to, because think about it. If you're a person who just goes to work 9 to 5 and you try to shut out all that noise, you can't escape because you're going to get notifications on your phone. You're going to be, your friends are going to talk about it. Your family's going to talk about it. And then that's going to lead to anxiety. That's going to lead to stress. And then we know, how do you escape from stress and anxiety? Temporarily. So you're either going to do drugs, alcohol, food, or some other vice you're going to do to try to escape all that stress and drama that you've been trying to avoid, but you can't avoid because technology has made it to the point where anything you look at, your TV and your phone now are connected. So even you're watching TV to watch the movie to escape it, you're going to get notifications coming through the movie to let you know it's a movie. I mean, TV's smart. So until you really shut all that out and intentionally say, I'm going to follow my plan. Here's my agenda. Here's my schedule for a day. Here's what I want to read. Here's what I want to do. Here's what I want to connect with. I don't really see how people are going to be able to just make that shift.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, I'm laughing because I don't have my phone connected. I mean, I just refuse to do that. So, my phone has nothing to do with my TV. Like that's never going to happen. And 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 this I use reluctantly. I mean, I have it. I know it's because that's what a phone is nowadays. And there's moments when it comes in handy because I have access to email and other things on it. But I use it as a phone primarily, and because I have really good information in those books behind me and the books over there, and I can apply it to what's happening in the world right now. And I get some information through, the technology. But to your point, yeah, I mean, the news coverage included following the Trump motorcade from Mar-a-Lago to the airport, and then following the Trump motorcade when he landed in New York to the courthouse. And one reporter referred to it as it's like the Los Angeles police following O.J. Simpson's the white Bronco video, which was one of the first times any of us saw that stuff on TV, right? When there was this motorcade of cops following O.J.'s vehicle. But that was the news yesterday. Like, there's a bunch of black SUVs on their way to an airport and then from an airport. And all of the networks were covering that. Like, oh man, do a book review of my book. Cover something that has value. I don't, and there's lots of other good stories out there.
Right.
But bring something that has value to the country, to the local community, whatever it is, and stop this, just a fixation on this one guy. And look, and I'm upset because you and I are talking about it, right? Because it's hard to make believe, that it's not there. Even, one last thing I'll say, and I know we're close to the top of the hour. The unfortunate turn of events towards the end of the women's national championship game, LSU versus Iowa. And I'm a former basketball coach. I love the game. I believe the first book I ever published was based on interscholastic and intercollegiate sports. Back in 1991. And what was simply, in my view of it, a question of what's good sportsmanship or not among players, with two players, a player from Iowa and one player from LSU. I'm not even going to say their names right now. Turned into, because one was white and one was black, turned into a racial thing, especially in social media. Like, it exploded into. And for me, it's a matter of, did both of these players at different times, do this thing and all that other stuff, and was that appropriate during the game or not? And if it wasn't, then the coaches respectively have to be held accountable for allowing that behavior for their players. But it became such a big deal and it became racial, and then it was fed by all the talking heads. Um, I watched it. I didn't see it as a racial incident. I saw it as a, you know, lack of sportsmanship, and both players, the Iowa player and the LSU player, had done that in that game and in previous games. And sportsmanship has shifted since I was, a basketball coach in the 1970s and 1980s. What's okay and what's not okay. So, but again, the media took it. Oh, here's a story we can pay attention to for the next 48 hours.
Well, what's interesting about that, I thought about that as well, is I would say two good things happened from that, or one good thing for sure, is it brought attention to women's sports.
Not the attention they necessarily wanted, but yes.
Yeah, but see, now you're gonna watch and pay attention to at least those two teams and those two women more than you've ever had before. Yeah. And they're both excellent players. Most people, that's what gets lost in the discussion, not their skill set, not their talent, but because one's black and one's white. And even it was interesting is I hate to say it this way, but the white one is not even upset of the taunt that the black one did. She's not personally offended. She didn't say, she ignored her. It's everyone else coming to her so-called aid to say, well, I'm going to speak on your behalf and talk about the atrocity. Because at the end of the day, and see, this is where I mentioned this before in several podcasts ago. That's why, even though I don't watch wrestling, I just don't have the time.
Yeah.
But I love the fact that wrestling is what it is. It's made to be entertaining. So that's what they do in wrestling. Actually, that's where that move comes from. It comes from John Cena saying, "You can't see me," right? So that was a wrestling taunt they did. See, wrestling doesn't have to apologize. It is what it is. It's like you watch it. If you're a fan of it, it's going to be as crazy as it is. And I think that if that's what gets women's sports more eye and more views, that folks are not going to watch it just on the merit of just watching talented teams, but if it's going to be controversial, not necessarily racially, but if the player is going to be a little bit more on the edge, then say football is allowed. You let women be a little bit more expressive, then that brings more eyeballs, more money, and more attention to it. Then I'm thinking it may end up being a good thing down the road.
Yeah, I think a lot of women, both coaches and players, both retired and currently playing, both out of school and currently playing in WNBA and in NCAA, might disagree with that because they don't want people coming to watch them play basketball because of some controversy. I've watched the women's game progress because when I was coaching, when I began coaching, when I was in school, Title IX hadn't been passed yet. So women didn't really have anywhere near the access they have now. That's part of what I write about in the book, is the subjugation of women. The skill level, the ability level, the competitiveness, all that continues to grow and increase simply because they were given access to the sports, and the funding is still nowhere near equal. And the problem remains that all of the money in sports comes from corporate advertising through televised and streamed events. If people aren't interested in watching it, it's not going to generate money. And for whatever reasons, more people are still going to tune into the men's game than the women's game. And that's a whole other conversation about. Those are other online debates, which I won't get into. But the level of play of the women's game over the last decades is extraordinarily, it continues to be increasingly higher and higher and higher. And I know personally, a friend of mine played on the Old Dominion national championship team back in, I think it was 70, I don't know if it was 78, 76, I forget, before, none of those games were on TV because it just wasn't, done. But I don't know. I don't think a lot of women want people watching their sport because of a question of sportsmanlike conduct. I think if we had a big following here, you'd get some cards and letters coming after that one. But
Well,
I don't know. I don't know because I agree in professional wrestling because of what it is. Uh, the outcome is kind of known behind the scenes already, and they're just designed to be entertaining. The outcome of the LSU Iowa game and the Final Four games in the whole tournament weren't done deals, and there were upsets, and it's based on coaching and player performance. So, but I know what you're saying.
I agree with you. I think that most professional folks are not going to want folks watching the sports for that reason. But I'm just saying, food for thought.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Connecticut women's NCAA for women. Connecticut won, I think, 4 or 5 championships. Then they won like 3 in a row, 4 in a row.
The women in Connecticut has won 11.
11. Yeah. And see, my point is, if you ask your average person, including myself, can you name one woman from any of those championship teams? I couldn't do it. But
but the thing is, though, I mean, and I happen to live in Connecticut, but I'm a St. John's alum, so I graduated from St. John's, which is has fallen on hard times basketball wise. But I mean, I can name Sue Bird and Diana Taurasi and Rebecca Lobo and others because I'm kind of a basketball guy.
Exactly. But see, what I'm saying is, to my point is, now the world can name these 2 women.
Yeah.
And it's not, even though they have the skill set, their talent definitely needs to be appreciated and admired. But what I'm saying is, but it's the drama they brought to it. And that's where, at the end of the day, drama sells. That's all I'm saying. So you got to look at what's going to increase ticket sales. If you want more pay and you want more attention, talent alone is not going to do it. You got to bring something else to the table that's going to do it. But anyway, I just wanted to add that little part.
Well,
go ahead.
Actually, LeBron and Steph Curry and some others drew a lot of attention to the player from Iowa because of what she was doing throughout the season. Her game looks like it's modeled on Steph Curry. I mean, she goes from 30 feet plus and can make the shot. So she was doing that the entire year. So a lot of NBA players began talking about her and tweeting about her just because of what she was doing. So her name got out there because of the professional men who were just looking at her and saying, whoa, what is that about? But you're right. The vast majority of Americans had not LeBron and Steph and some others pointed to her, wouldn't have known about it.
And that bravado to even shoot from half court. I mean, Steph taunts in his games. He does this, and no one gets upset about that. I'm putting you to sleep. It's sleep time. That's what he's saying. That's similar to "you can't see me," however the taunt is. Yeah. But at the end of the day, I like I said, we've reached a point of the show. We can go on and on, but I do want to give you an opportunity to say, what do you see as our next steps that you want to let folks know, based on the topic of today's discussion, that we can become more fully human?
Yeah, I'd say ask a personal question. Ask for an individual, beginning with the individual. Ask yourself if you're happy with the state of the country. If you are, I don't know what to say to you. If you're not, consider what you think needs to shift, and then take a close look at what it is you personally could shift, whether it's with your children, your parents, your teachers, your students, your colleagues, whatever you do for a living. How could you shift? Not try to change somebody else, but what shift could you make to lead more to this idea of love, friendship, relative egalitarianism, as Christakis refers to it, in your own life, and just begin to make those changes. If you think everything is okay, then I would suggest you read my book, Healing America's Narratives, or read How to Be an Anti-Racist, or read Unworthy Republic. I mean, there's a lot of great literature out there that could show you that, in fact, everything's not really okay. But that would be the first step. Take a look at yourself, how you view things, and how could you shift some small thing, a little bit at a time, to make it a more peaceful world in your little chunk of the world. So,
excellent. Well, again, we reached the part of the show, and we reached the top of the show, I should say, where as we bring our show to an end, we want to give examples of who we believe are individuals, either past or present, who have exhibited the characteristics of becoming more fully human in their behaviors and their actions. And I'm gonna throw it out to you first, Reggie, to throw you out there to say, do you have anyone in mind?
Yeah. In fact, it's related to the basketball stuff. So this particular Final Four um, was the last Final Four where Jim Nantz, who had been calling Final Four games since the 1990s, this is his last one. And I don't know really that much about him other than he's the voice behind it. But he's, according to the coaches and the players from Final Fours and tournaments back a quarter of a century, give or take. He had a level of both compassion, professionalism in his profession as a play-by-play announcer and the host of a sporting event, to be one of the. It's the reason that he did that many Final Fours, and he also does it at the Masters golf tournament. But I think he's somebody who fully lived into his calling, continues to do so. He's not retired. He is from the Final Four. But in terms of bringing of treating the people he comes in contact with well, being somewhat objective in his calling of the games, and really welcoming in the guys that work with him. In this case, it's Bill Raftery, who's a former coach at Seton Hall, and Grant Hill, who played at Duke and played in the NBA. He just, he's able to make them better as well, because they were new to his profession. And so I think he's an example of that, in an entertainment business, where he's just been compassionate, he's been wise, he's been informed, he's been respectful for over a quarter of a century. And he was honored by coaches, players, colleagues, in many ways over the Final Four weekend. So Jim Nantz comes up to, and that just came to me now. I wasn't planning on saying that. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm actually gonna, I saw something that happened as a result of all the Final Four, women's Final Four fallout you're talking about, and it brought to mind Shaquille O'Neal, and I want to give him this credit because not only do I see that Shaq is a very giving and helpful person, the kind of serving person, that's the word I was looking for in the context, because of how he uses his brand. He understands the importance behind this brand. Yeah. I've seen him go out and create another show where he takes a rapper with him and they go and invest in different businesses, predominantly Black businesses. And not only they invest financially, but they invest exposure-wise by putting them on the show, because they're going to use their name to get you to watch the show. They're going to get a chance to see that product and you see that entrepreneur that you never would have seen before. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people have come against Shaq because some of the comments he's made that may not been on the socially accepted by most of Black Twitter, so to speak, who may disagree with him on some issues. They felt he's been not as Black in his thoughts as they would like. But that's why I'm saying this is about becoming more fully human. When you transcend that allegiance to people who say, well, because you're part of our tribe or our group, this is how you must behave, as opposed to just doing the right thing. I believe it was Dr. Wayne Dyer who said it's a big difference between being right and doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people don't get that distinction. And to me, I've seen Shaq show a lot of humanistic qualities and behaviors. It shows that he's just really a great person. At the end of the day, he wants to give, he wants to teach, he wants to be a mentor. And he's grown to see Shaq when he was in his 20s and 30s, and he couldn't get along with Kobe, and you saw the arrogance and the ego to where he is now in his 50s. I've seen the maturity and the growth in him. So I just want to give him his flowers and recognize that I recognize your growth. I recognize you're human and you're growing to become more fully human. And I want to start pointing out more people who may not have a lifetime. And that's what the show is not about, saying you have to be perfect your whole life. It's about saying you want to be committed to growth minded, and we are human. But in our quest to become more fully human, we want to seek to become better people than we were previously. So that's why I choose Shaq in that context.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, thank you for that.
Well, thank you again, Reggie, for the topic. I'm amazed at how much, even though I read your book, but when you have a discussion with you, how much more value I get from our discussions and how much having this ability to have this forum with you really brings it home and it helps me really connect it more than just reading it once, but really begin to apply it. And then these next steps, I believe, I know they're definitely helpful for me, but I believe hopefully the folks are following through on them and reading some of the sources you're citing. I know it would be helpful for them as well.
Yeah. Thank you, King. As always, I appreciate the opportunity to have these conversations with you. So thank you as well.
And listening audience, I want to thank you again for tuning in to another episode. I know we went kind of longer than we normally do, but I hope you enjoyed the banter we had back and forth. But again, if you like what we're saying, watch us on our Facebook, watch the replay, engage with us in the comment sections. We'd love to get your feedback and hear what your thoughts are. And until next Wednesday at 10 a.m., that's all focused on doing our part to become more fully human. Thank you.